Dad, the inheritance, it's mine, obviously. That goes without saying. Just one sentence, short, cold, and stripped of all warmth. That one sentence silenced the 82-year-old father. It wasn't that he was destitute. It wasn't that he didn't love his son. It was just that. After 40 years of pouring his entire life into building something from nothing, it was all dismissed in the end with a single casual remark. It's mine, obviously. Goes without saying. And it was from that exact moment he began a new journey, not with shouting or arguments or blame, but with the quiet act of rewriting a single sheet of paper. It was his last will and testament, and 3 months later, when the final sentence was read aloud before the entire family, no one could find a single word to say in response. To my son, I leave nothing. My name is George Peterson. I was born in 1943, on a small side street in a working-class neighborhood of Chicago. My father was a carpenter. Rough, calloused hands, and a wooden toolbox filled with his well-worn chisels. That was my father in a nutshell. My mother died of tuberculosis when I was 10. From then on, it was just me and my dad, sticking together. On sunny days, he'd work. On rainy days, we'd huddle in our little clapboard shack, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls, dreaming of the day we might live in a proper house. Post-war America wasn't all parades and prosperity, not for people like us. Our roof leaked, and getting government cheese meant standing in a line that stretched for blocks. Even as a grade schooler, I understood that a full belly was more important than a textbook. I quit school after 7th grade and threw myself into the rough and tumble of life. Pushing handcarts, hauling freight, picking up scrap metal along the railroad tracks, I did any job I could find. When I was 20, a friend got me a job as a laborer on a big construction site in Milwaukee. Back then, all I had was my strength. I barely said a word. But I watched everything. How they mixed the concrete, how they measured the foundations, how they tied the rebar. Every night, I'd sketch what I'd seen in a little notebook and write down what I learned. I still have that notebook. The pages are yellowed and brittle now, but that was my first and only school. At 30, I came back to Chicago. I convinced a friend to lend me a little seed money and started my own small crew. I had to find the jobs myself, run the sites myself. Sometimes, clients wouldn't pay. Once, my whole crew quit on me, and I had to haul stones and finish the job alone. But I never, not once, gave up. By the time I was 45, I owned 3 pieces of land. A plot in the suburbs, out in Naperville, a parcel in the industrial area of South Chicago, and a prime spot near Union Station. I built a 2-story house, too. It wasn't fancy, but it was big enough for 3 generations to live under one roof. Out front, I planted an oak tree with my own 2 hands. It was a reminder to myself, never forget your roots. I have one son, Michael. He was born when I was 38, a late-in-life child. I gave that boy every advantage I could. I made sure he got a good education, had him learn a second language, even took him on a trip to Europe when he was in middle school. I wanted to give him all the things I could only dream of when I was his age. I once told my wife, I don't care about our own retirement. All that matters is that we leave a solid foundation for our boy. I believed that. I believed that a parent's job isn't to live their child's life for them, but to pave the way. Once a child can stand on their own 2 feet, the parent should step back and just watch. The year I turned 70, I had a mild heart attack. That's when I decided to retire. I handed over the construction company I had built, everything, to my son. I signed the deed to the house over to him. I even prepared the paperwork to transfer the 3 properties into his name. I believed from the bottom of my heart that there's no such thing as betrayal in a family. Not with your own flesh and blood. After I retired, I moved into a room on the 2nd floor. It was a room I'd designed myself back in 1986. My days were simple. I'd water my plants in the morning, read the paper, sometimes go out to meet an old friend or drive by one of the old job sites. I was at peace. I truly believed I had left behind a solid legacy, not just of wealth, but of values. But then, slowly, something started to change. Something was off with the company. My son was hiring and firing people constantly. He kept changing architects, and his decisions always seemed rushed, impatient. The air in the house grew chilly too. We ate dinner together less and less. I didn't hear my grandson's laughter as much anymore. And my son, he no longer had time to even ask me how I was doing. I told myself, it's the pressure. It's a different era. It's better if I don't interfere. But deep down, a thought was starting to take root. Had I become unnecessary in this house? I didn't say a word. I just kept my distance. I thought that's what a father was supposed to do. It was okay to be forgotten, okay to be hurt, as long as your child was all right. But the solid foundation I thought I had built, it turned out to be something only I believed in. And my greatest mistake was believing this, that when you leave something behind for someone, you are also leaving behind a sense of gratitude and love. Since my retirement, I've lived in my room on the second floor. I designed the room myself. It has an east-facing window, and in the morning, a soft light filters in through the branches of that old oak tree I planted those years ago. Some of my habits haven't changed. I still wake up at 5, make a cup of tea, open the newspaper, and water the plants on my small balcony. It's a simple routine, but it's what makes me feel like I'm still alive. Not just surviving, but living. It gives me a sense of purpose, a small anchor in the day. My son, now officially the president of the company, grew busier and busier. He'd leave early in the morning and come home late at night. Our family dinners became rarer and rarer, dwindling from a weekly ritual to a monthly obligation, and then to almost nothing at all. I understood. I knew the weight he carried on his shoulders was not a light one. The economy had changed. The business was more competitive than when I started with just a hammer and a loan from a friend. But I could feel it, day by day. An invisible distance, a quiet, cold space growing between father and son, between the founder and his successor. When I retired, I handed over nearly all authority to my son. The company, the assets, the house itself. I wanted him to have a clean slate, to feel the full weight and freedom of ownership. I thought it was the right thing to do, the ultimate act of trust. I didn't want to be the old man looking over his shoulder, second-guessing his every move. I had my time. This was his. The title to the company was transferred into his name, the bank accounts too. It's just more convenient for handling business, Dad, he'd said, and I'd handed over the access, even the deed to the house. We're family, Dad, it's all the same, I remember him saying, and I trusted him enough to put it in his hands. After all, what kind of father would ever doubt his own son? What kind of foolishness is that? But then, one day, something surfaced in my memory. It might have seemed like a small thing at the time, a trivial detail. But looking back on it now, I can see it for what it was, a sign, a warning I had failed to notice. It happened last month. I decided I needed a checkup with my doctor and went to the bank to withdraw a little cash from my personal savings account to cover the copay. I walked up to the counter, and the teller gave me a polite, professional smile. "Sir," she said, tapping at her keyboard, "I see here that power of attorney for this account has already been assigned to another party." I called Michael immediately. His voice on the other end was smooth, unbothered. "Well, you're getting on in years, Dad, right? I just wanted to make sure I could handle things quickly if anything ever happened to you." I managed a weak, bitter smile. "Oh, I see," was all I said, and I let it go. Then, on another day, I was having lunch with an old acquaintance, Dave Miller, who used to be my head of procurement for years. He stirred his iced tea, his brow furrowed with concern. "George, I'm a little worried about the company these days," he said, his voice low. "It seems like a lot of the projects have these impossibly short deadlines. To be honest, it feels like the quality is starting to get uneven." I just nodded, saying nothing. But inside, I felt it. A quiet cracking sound. The feeling of something solid, something I had built with my own 2 hands, slowly starting to crumble. And then came the day it all fell apart. It was a rare evening when the whole family was gathered for dinner. I decided to ask, just casually, a simple question. "Michael," I said, keeping my tone light, like it was just another one of those conversations between generations. "If, heaven forbid, something were to happen to me suddenly, have you given any thought to how you'd divide the inheritance among the grandkids?" I expected a pause, a moment of reflection, perhaps even a slightly uncomfortable laugh. But he didn't hesitate for a second. Without missing a beat, he laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of any real humor. "Divide it? Divide what? It's all mine, Dad. It's already all in my name, remember?" After he said it, he picked up a piece of steak with his fork and put it in his mouth, chewing as if he'd just commented on the weather, as if what he had just declared was the most obvious, natural fact in the world. I was speechless. It wasn't because I was surprised. No, the signs had been there. It was the ache in my chest that stole my words. A deep, hollow pain. The person sitting across from me was not the little 7-year-old boy who used to hold my hand at construction sites, his eyes wide with wonder. The boy who would ask, his voice full of innocent excitement, "Daddy, are we going to build another house tomorrow?" That little boy was gone. In his place sat a grown man, a successful man by all accounts. But there was no warmth in his eyes, and in his answer, there wasn't a single shred of compassion. I didn't lash out. I didn't raise my voice. I thought, maybe this is just how the world works now. Maybe society had shaped him into this. Maybe, for him, a legacy wasn't about love or memory. It was just a collection of numbers on a spreadsheet and signatures on a document. Maybe he truly believed that the person whose name was on the title was the only one with the right to decide anything. But I knew one thing with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. The question I had asked him tonight, the question of my legacy, of what I would leave behind, it was a question that, by tomorrow, would no longer matter. I couldn't sleep that night. In the deep, quiet hours of the early morning, I went to the small safe I kept in my closet and took out the copies of the documents I had so carefully filed away. The business transfer agreement, the power of attorney I had signed for the bank, the property management contracts for the 3 parcels of land. The deeds were still in my name, but I had given him full authority to manage them. And finally, a single folded sheet of paper. A simple will I had handwritten when I turned 65. It was nothing official, not notarized or witnessed, just a piece of paper outlining my wishes. I sat down at my desk. My hands were trembling slightly, but my mind had never felt so sharp, so clear. It hit me then. I still had time. And even more importantly, I realized something else. I still held the rights. I still had power. There was no anger in my heart. The last thing I wanted was to shatter the bond between a father and his son. But at the same time, another thought burned even stronger within me. If I did nothing, if I just stayed silent and let this happen, I would be leaving my grandchildren with a terrible lesson. I would be teaching them that greed is rewarded, that being ruthless is the way to win. And so, I made a decision. I would write a new will. But this time, it would not be a simple handwritten note. I dug through my old files until I found the business card for Mr. Scard. Collins, the attorney who had helped me with the land contract back in 2004. I drove down to his office in a loop, carrying a briefcase with all the original documents. I sat across from him and laid it all out. "I need to draw up a new last will and testament," I told him. "I want it to be ironclad, legally unassailable. And I want you to seal it. I don't want anyone to see it until after I'm gone." Mr. Collins looked at me for a long moment, his gaze steady and serious. Finally, he asked quietly, "Mr. Peterson, are you absolutely certain about this?" I gave him a slow, deep nod. Life is full of uncertainties. But of this one thing, I was absolutely sure. It was time for this old father to teach his son one final lesson. This past February, Chicago was unusually wet. A cold, persistent rain fell for days, and a damp wind found its way through every crack in the window frames. It was the kind of cold that seeped deep into your bones, especially when you're an old man like me. On the morning of February 4th, I was in the kitchen, making my tea just like I did every other morning. But then, without any warning, the room suddenly tilted. A strange dizziness washed over me, and all the feeling vanished from my hands and feet. The next thing I knew, my entire body was collapsing to the floor. The teapot shattered, and hot tea splashed across the linoleum. I don't know how long I was lying there. When I came to, my vision was filled with the sterile white light of a hospital room, and beside my bed, there was no one. The doctor told me I'd had a minor stroke. He said I was lucky, that because it was discovered relatively quickly, I wouldn't have any major lasting effects. But for the 3 days I was in that hospital, not a single member of my family came to visit me, not one phone call, not one text message, nothing. For 3 days I lay there staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles, asking myself the same question over and over again. If I had died right there on the kitchen floor, would anyone have even noticed? The father who had raised a child, paid for his education, and weathered all of life's storms with his family was now just a name on an admission form in a hospital file. No one came. The only sound was the squeak of the nurse's shoes in the hallway. On the morning of the 3rd day, I was discharged. A young doctor politely explained that I needed to rest for a while. No strenuous activity. "You have to take it easy," he said. I nodded, thanked him, and called a taxi to take me home. The rain was still falling that afternoon. I let myself in quietly through the back door. I didn't want to make a sound. I made my way up the stairs, heading for the room on the 2nd floor where I had lived for so many years. My room. But I stopped dead at the doorway. What stood before me was a space I didn't recognize. A storage closet. My desk was gone. The simple wooden chair where I used to sit and read the newspaper had vanished. In their place were mountains of cardboard boxes, overflowing garbage bags, and dusty, broken pieces of old furniture. The junk was piled nearly to the ceiling. Over in the corner, I saw the plastic litter box for the cat my son and his wife had recently adopted. A foul smell, a mixture of damp cardboard and rotting cat food, filled the air and caught in the back of my throat. For a moment, I thought I was in the wrong room. As I came down the stairs, I passed my son Michael on his way up. He gave me a quick glance and said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, "I'm getting the room sorted out." "You're getting older, Dad. It's better for you to be on the 1st floor, closer to the bathroom, right? That way, you won't have to deal with the stairs if something happens." I didn't say a word. I just continued on quietly, down to the 1st floor, to what he called a more convenient spot. It wasn't a room. It was a corner of the storage area in the back of the house, sectioned off with a thin sheet of plywood. A worn, stained piece of remnant carpet had been thrown down on the concrete floor. The space itself was tiny, maybe 8 feet by 10, not even 100 square feet. There was no window, no sunlight, no fresh air. A single, dusty bare bulb hung from a wire in the ceiling, and laid out on the floor, waiting for me, was a thin, flimsy mattress. On the plywood wall, the old sign was still hanging. A piece of cardboard with tool storage scrawled on it in black marker. I suppose he forgot to take it down. I stepped into the space. The only thing I had with me was a small duffel bag with a few changes of clothes. My bookshelf, my old photographs, the orchids I'd spent years tending to, everything was gone. I sat down on the mattress and leaned my back against the cold wall. I looked up at the exposed rafters of the ceiling, listening to the sound of the rain drumming against the roof outside. That's when a question floated up from the depths of my mind. When does a person start getting kicked out of a place they built with their own 2 hands? I didn't sleep at all that night. There was no anger, no tears, no words of blame. There was only silence. A suffocating, choked quiet. It felt like a box packed so tightly with every emotion I had, just moments away from bursting. I got up at 4 in the morning. From my bag, I took out the bundle of old documents I had carried with me since the day I founded the company. The deeds to the land, the company's articles of incorporation, sales agreements, old memos, and A faded copy of my wedding photograph with my wife, Eleanor. The corners were soft and blurred with time. I went through them, one by one. The day I bought that first piece of land just outside of Chicago. The day I sketched out the plans for this very house with my own hands, walked the property with a tape measure, and decided exactly where the great oak in the front yard should stand. I'm sure I said it back then. A home should be a place you return to. It should never be a place you're driven out of. Muttering those words to myself, I picked up my cell phone. And there, in the pre-dawn darkness, I called my attorney, Mr. Collins. I've made my decision, Mr. Collins. I want to rewrite my will. This time, I'm leaving my son nothing. On the other end of the line, Mr. Collins was silent for a long moment. Then he said simply, I understand. I'll come to your home today. I hung up the phone and gently lowered myself back onto the mattress. My hands were shaking. It wasn't because of my illness. I knew. When a father has to use a lawyer to speak to his own son, something inside his heart has truly, finally died. I don't hate him. This isn't about getting even. It's about making things clear. I didn't want anyone to twist the truth after I was gone. I couldn't let anyone say, my father left everything to me. I understood then. A father's love isn't about infinite patience. It is a quiet resolve to keep your child from losing their way, from forgetting what it means to be a decent human being. And that night, in a windowless room lit by a single, dim bulb, I began to rewrite my own fate. I couldn't sleep. But strangely, no tears came either. It felt as if every last drop of emotion had been wrung out of me, leaving only something heavy and wordless hanging deep inside my chest. It was a strange sensation, as if I were floating inside someone else's body, looking down on my own life from a great, cold distance. As the sky began to lighten, I went out into the backyard. The oak tree in the front of the house, the one I had cared for and painstakingly pruned for over 30 years, had been brutally hacked at. One whole side of it was gone, lopped off without care. It was probably for a security camera or to make way for some new power lines. It was in the way. That was the only reason there could be. I reached out and touched the rough, scarred bark. It was the same tree, but the proud, straight posture I remembered was gone. Some of the roots were exposed, clawing at the dry, cracked earth. No one had been watering it. It had just been left to fend for itself. I went back inside, intending to make some tea, but the water in the electric kettle barely covered the heating element, and what little came out was lukewarm. It seemed the kettle was broken. It wouldn't stay hot anymore. My favorite mug, the one I'd used for years, was nowhere to be found. I had no choice but to use an old, chipped plastic cup I found in the back of a cabinet. They were all small things, but when small things pile up, they become a silent message. You are no longer a priority in this house. I started paying attention to the other little changes in my daily life. My meals were prepared separately now, and no one called me when they were ready. The washer and dryer had been moved from the main floor to the second, making it impossible for me to use them. I was expected to rely on the kindness of neighbors or a laundromat. The television in the living room was always tuned to some show I couldn't make heads or tails of, full of noise and flashing lights. And, gradually, no one asked me anything anymore. This house was once a family's nest. Now, it had become a temporary shelter for an invisible old man. I wasn't rewriting my will simply as a hurt father. There was a deeper reason. If I left this world without saying a word, I realized that a moral void would be left behind in this house. Sure, my son might be the legal heir to the property, but if I remained silent, he would surely believe, as long as my name is on the deed, I can do whatever I want. I had always hoped my grandson would take over the company one day, but if he saw this, if he saw how his own grandfather was being treated and felt nothing, then what would he grow up believing in? Love? Gratitude? Or just strategy? A question began to echo, louder and clearer, in my heart. If you can no longer guide your child with words, do you have any choice but to teach them with consequences? I stood before the mantelpiece. in front of the framed photograph of my wife, Eleanor, and lit a small candle. Though she'd been gone for over a decade, I spoke to her in a small, quiet voice. "I'm sorry, Ellie. I think we spoiled him too much. But this time, I'm not going to look the other way." Then, I sat down at a small, rickety card table I'd set up in my new corner of the house. And I began to write the first line of my new will, ready to turn everything upside down after I was gone. This wasn't revenge. This was an act of restoring justice. Here, inside the very house I had built with my life's blood. It was a night in early March. For weeks, I had been eating my meals alone, a solitary figure in that small, windowless room on the first floor. Then, out of the blue, my daughter-in-law called out to me, an invitation to join the family for dinner. It was the first time the three of us had shared a table in what felt like an eternity. Me, my son Michael, and his wife. The meal wasn't what you'd call extravagant, but it was a proper dinner. Baked sea bass, a simple vegetable soup, an omelet, sautéed green beans. Everything was seasoned just right. I have to admit, I was a little surprised. I took my seat at the table in silence, picking up my fork, but the air was thick with an unnatural stillness, heavy and waiting. My daughter-in-law offered a thin smile as she carefully placed a piece of the fish onto my plate. It was the first time she had done something like that for me since the day I retired. Something was wrong. An old man's intuition, honed over 82 years, was sounding an alarm bell deep inside me. It was a quiet, insistent whisper that said, "Something is about to happen." And my gut feeling, as it so often has, turned out to be right on the money. We were about a third of the way through the meal when Michael put his fork down with a sharp clatter. He leaned back in his chair, a look of bored impatience on his face, and then he spoke. There was no hesitation, no preamble, no attempt to soften the blow. "Look, you're not going to be around that much longer. Can't you just get the will written up? It's becoming a hassle for us." The words struck me like a shard of ice piercing my chest. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Cold, calculating, utterly devoid of emotion. I didn't answer him right away. I simply speared a single green bean with my fork, brought it to my mouth, and chewed it slowly, deliberately. Then I set my fork down, looked my son straight in the eye, and said, "And if I told you that I was planning on leaving my entire estate to someone else, what would you think about that, Michael?" His eyebrows shot up, knitting together in a scowl. In an instant, the look of confident disdain in his eyes curdled into pure irritation. And then, he slammed his fist down on the table. The water in our glasses sloshed, and soup splashed over the rim of my bowl. "What right do you have to do that? It's all in my name already, isn't it? The house, the company, the bank accounts, everything is under my name. Have you forgotten?" His wife flinched, startled, and tried to quiet him, her voice a tiny, frightened whisper. "Michael, please lower your voice." He completely ignored her. He didn't even spare her a glance. I remained perfectly still in my chair. I showed no anger. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my shirt, slowly pulled out a piece of paper folded into thirds, and laid it on the table between us. It was yellowed with age, but the typewritten letters were still crisp and clear. Across the top of that single document, a title was printed in bold capital letters: Conditional Transfer. Agreement unexecuted. My son's eyes widened. I held his gaze, my own steady and unwavering, and I spoke slowly, letting each word land with its full weight. "Did you ever actually read it, son? Those assets were placed under your management, in your name, on a provisional basis. The final, legal transfer of ownership was never completed. As of this moment, all of it, every last bit of it still belongs to me. And if I decide to, I can change everything." The color drained from his face. He snatched the paper from the table, and I could see it trembling in his hand. He flipped it over, read it again, his expression a mixture of disbelief and panic. I continued, my voice remaining quiet even. "You've made a mistake, Michael. Did you think I was just some senile old man? Did you think that because I was old, I didn't understand the law anymore? Well, let me tell you something. In my years on construction sites, I signed hundreds of contracts, thousands. And the important documents, I've always kept every single one. My daughter-in-law said nothing. She just lowered her head, staring at her hands in her lap. A deep silence fell over the room. The only sound was the quiet tick-tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was as if it were counting out the seconds of the immense, tense gulf that had opened up between two generations. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I had lost my appetite. Clutching an old napkin in my hand, I spoke in a low but firm voice. Starting today, I'm not hiding anything anymore. The price you are going to pay is the truth. And the thing about the truth is, it doesn't need shouting or crying to make itself known. It comes out all on its own. I turned and walked slowly toward the stairs. Behind me, I left a half-eaten dinner, the stunned, vacant face of my son, and the figure of his young wife, frozen in her seat like a statue carved from stone. Back in my room, I pulled a worn, leather-bound journal from a drawer. The corners were scuffed and soft from years of use. I sat on the edge of the flimsy mattress and opened it. With a steady hand, I wrote, 3 months since I had the new will drawn up. Tonight, he finally showed his true colors. There is no anger, no sadness, only disappointment. Because, deep down, I still believed in him. But that's over now. Now, it's time to set things right. I closed the journal and placed it gently on the small nightstand. A cold draft slipped in through a crack in the old window frame, making the thin curtain flutter almost imperceptibly. I pulled the blanket over me and stared up at the water-stained ceiling. I no longer dreamed of a peaceful end. I no longer waited for the day my son might finally look at me and say, "Thank you." Now, there was only one thing left in my heart: to leave behind the truth. And my grandson, there is something I must pass on to the next generation. A single, vital lesson. You must never allow greed to be rewarded with silence. I didn't know how my son would act tomorrow. But I knew one thing for certain. The time had come. The time for the father who had always stayed in the background to finally step forward. It was time to protect the value of what I had spent my entire life building. That night, even after returning to my room, sleep wouldn't come. I sat by the small window, or more accurately, the small transom left for ventilation near the ceiling. Outside, a damp wind, the kind that follows a late winter rain, whispered through the gaps in the siding. It carried a faint, musty smell into the quiet of the night. I just sat there, motionless, staring at my own shadow cast upon the worn linoleum floor. The man in that shadow wasn't the one I remembered, not the proud founder of a construction company who could command a worksite with a single look. No, the shadow on the floor belonged to a frail old man with stooped shoulders and thinning hair. It felt as if the chasm that had opened up between the generations was a silent, invisible force, slowly pulling me apart from the inside out. His words kept echoing in my mind, over and over again. "It's all in my name already, isn't it? You don't have any right to it anymore." That single sentence, it did more than just trample on my pride. It laid bare the truth that was buried deep in my son's heart. What he was really saying was this: if a parent has no assets, if their name isn't on the deed, then their very existence carries no weight. I found myself wondering, since when did a father's rights get measured by whether his name was on a property title? A memory surfaced, clear as day. The winter he was 6 years old, when he came down with a terrible fever and was delirious for 2 straight days. I sat by his bedside all night, changing the cool cloths on his forehead, checking his temperature, whispering that it would be okay. When morning finally came, I was so exhausted that I had fallen asleep right there on the floor next to his bed. That was me. And when he was 10, that summer I took him to a work site for the first time. I remember putting my hand on his back as he looked up nervously at the tall steel frame and telling him, "In the construction business," I used to tell him, "you have to be able to stand on what you've built." Right now, he's standing in a high place. But he no longer seems to remember, or even care to remember, what lies beneath his feet. In all the months since my retirement, I'd hoped to hear my son ask me, just once, "Dad, you want to take a trip somewhere? Maybe see the Grand Canyon?" No. If that was too much to ask, then even just a simple, "Dad, have you eaten yet?" that would have been enough. But those words? They never came. It was as if the father who had given up everything was no longer deserving of even the smallest consideration. And now? He was demanding more. He was even demanding my will. He wanted to decide the final shape of my life, to mold my last wishes to fit his own needs. I may be old, but I'm not gone yet. My mind is still sharp. And I know that within the time I have left, I can still leave him one final lesson. My eyes drifted to the drawer in the nightstand beside my bed. Inside, alongside that unexecuted conditional transfer agreement, were the stock certificates, the temporary power of attorney documents, records of our past dealings, and every other trace of the trust I had placed in my son when I handed everything over. Trust. It's the easiest thing in the world for a person to give away, and once it's been betrayed, it's the one thing you can never get back. I don't know what will become of the relationship between this father and his son. Even I can't see that far down the road. But I do know one thing for certain. If I don't stand up right now, the idea that you can forget gratitude, that you can erase your debts to the past, will become an accepted right in this family. I may be just an 82-year-old man living in a small, windowless room. But in this moment, I am the only one who can decide what to leave behind, and to whom. After that night, after that confrontation at the dinner table, my son and I exchanged no more words. He did not come to my room. I did not seek him out. The whole house fell into a deep quiet, like an old church that no one visits anymore. The only sounds were the shuffle of my slippers on the floor, the meow of the cat, and the whisper of the wind leaking through the old window frames on the first floor. As always, I woke up early, made myself a cup of tea, and placed a call to Mr. Hun, Collins's office. 3 days later, I was sitting in the conference room of his firm. It was the same room where, back in the 90s and the 2000s, I had signed countless construction contracts, the same polished dark wood table, the same shelves of meticulously organized legal binders, and Mr. Collins himself, looking much the same as he always had, quiet, precise, with a gaze that seemed to see right through to the heart of a matter. I laid out all the documents on the table before him. I didn't raise my voice, but every word I spoke was clear and steady. I want to draw up a new will. I want it done by the book, with a notary and witnesses. And I want everything frozen. I want it sealed so that no one can touch it, no one can see it, until the day I die. Mr. Collins simply nodded. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He had probably seen this kind of thing 100 times before. But he also knew. He knew that when a man like me makes a decision like this, it isn't born from hatred. It's born from something much quieter. The moment when you finally, silently, reach the end of your patience. It took 2 weeks to coordinate with the bank, the title company, and a third-party trust administrator. When it was done, every last detail was in place. The house in East Chicago, appraised at approximately $250,000. I left it to my eldest granddaughter, Sarah. She was the only one who came to sit with me every Saturday afternoon just to talk. The one who'd bring me clumsy homemade cookies and ask, her voice full of a child's simple curiosity, "Grandpa, whose house is this going to be someday?" I finally had an answer for her. The company stock. I donated all of it to a charitable foundation that provides free training and apprenticeships for young people entering the building trades. If my own son wouldn't value the foundation I had built, then I would give it to someone else who understood its worth. My savings, approximately $180,000. I had it divided equally among my 3 grandchildren, but I attached a single condition. They would only receive the money upon providing proof of graduation from a 4-year university or certification in a state-licensed profession. I wasn't leaving them money to be spent. I was leaving them money to get started. The final will was sealed in a thick manila envelope marked, "Strictly Confidential." The instructions were clear: to be opened only upon confirmation of the testator's death or legal incapacitation. It was then deposited into a safe deposit box at the bank. I left no loopholes, no way out. I signed my name carefully on every single page. My hand did not shake. I had no hesitation. In that moment, I felt as if I had come back to life for the first time in years, because I had finally done it. I had done what so many parents should have done much, much sooner. I refused to let my silence become complicity. 2 days later, when I returned home, my son already knew. Maybe someone at the bank had let it slip. Maybe a notification was mistakenly sent from one of the legal offices. I don't know how he found out, but when I walked through the front door, he was on his knees in the middle of the living room. It was the first time I had seen him look so defeated in years. It wasn't a gesture of respect. It was a posture of pure fear and loss. He wasn't crying, but his voice trembled when he spoke. "I was wrong, Dad. I was wrong. It's just, if you left it all to someone else, I felt like your whole life, everything you built, it would all be for nothing." I stood there, looking down at him in silence. I remembered hoisting him onto my shoulders and walking through the tall grass of an empty field that would one day become a subdivision. I remembered teaching him the difference between real cement and a cheap mix. The son who had been my greatest pride was now kneeling before me. But I didn't yell, I didn't scold him or try to lecture him. Flashed one thing, as quiet as the wind, but with a weight I knew would settle deep in his soul. "I'm still alive, son, but I guess in your heart, I might already be dead." He looked up, his face pale, his mouth open but no words coming out. I turned my back and walked toward the stairs. Inside my chest, there was no anger, only a strange sense of relief. This was the right thing to do, I thought to myself, quietly. From that day on, the subject of property or inheritance was never mentioned. Again in that house. The arguments stopped. The subtle probing, the tension. It all vanished. But I knew. I knew that something inside of him had started to crumble. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was the heavy reality of his loss. The only thing I can say for sure is this: he no longer saw himself as the rightful heir to anything. After that, I began to write more than just a daily journal. I started writing down my decisions, the values I wanted to leave behind. I wanted to bequeath my thoughts, not just my money. My way of life, not just my possessions. I called Mr. Collins one last time. "Please," I told him, "include these handwritten notes. I want them filed right alongside the will. Because I know, a will that only divides property isn't enough. It's the will that builds character that is the only thing truly worth leaving behind." One evening, I saw my granddaughter sitting on the back porch steps, reading a book. I walked over quietly and asked her what she was reading. She smiled and held up the book for me to see. "The Psychology of Architecture and Space," one asked her. "Are you thinking about becoming an architect someday?" She nodded eagerly, her eyes lighting up. "I want to build a house for you, Grandpa. A place where you can read the newspaper all day long. A quiet place where nobody can bother you, where you can just relax." I couldn't help but laugh, hard, but there were tears welling up in my eyes. I have no desire to be revered after I'm gone. I only hope. Grandpa lived here, and he fought, without silence, until the very end. If just one person remembers me that way, then that is more than enough. From the day my will was notarized and sealed away, I felt a little lighter. It wasn't that I thought, well, that's over. It was just that the fear that everything I had built might be used as a tool for fighting after my death, that fear was finally lifted from my shoulders. It was like a gardener who has finally finished putting a fence around his garden, who has hammered in the "keep out" sign, and can now sit down and drink his tea in peace without worrying about a single soul. Every morning, I write. It's not a letter or some sentimental diary. It's a living record. My own personal manual for the next generation. I write down the most important lessons I learned when I first started in the construction business. That no matter how invisible it is, you must never, ever cut corners on the foundation. That a house can start to lean from the misalignment of a single, tiny brick. And most important of all, that a true craftsman must possess a conscience above all else. You must never be ashamed of your own work. Not in front of the client, not in front of anyone, but first and foremost, not in front of yourself. To be honest, I don't know if what I'm writing will ever be useful to anyone. But I have to believe. I believe that someday, when someone in my family reads these words, they will think to themselves, this man wasn't just some old-fashioned father. He was a man who lived honestly, true to his convictions, right up until the very end. One afternoon, I stopped by a camera shop near the train station and had them restore an old photograph. It was a picture from the day this house was finished. A picture of me, much younger, standing out front with my wife and our little boy. They took the faded, yellowed photograph and restored it with painstaking care. And when I held the new print in my hand, I let out a small laugh and said to myself, well, at least this is one title they can't change. I put the photograph in a simple wooden frame and set it on the nightstand next to my bed. I look at it every night before I go to sleep. That has become my ritual. It's not for the sake of nostalgia. It's to remember. To remember that this house was once a dream, and that even now, it stands here. As a symbol of a choice made right. That night, after my son knelt before me, he became quieter somehow. He stopped talking about property. He said less and less at the dinner table. The meals were still served cold. The silence at dinner was still the same. But that sharp, irritated edge in his voice, it was gone. His wife was quiet too. The house felt like a trough of low pressure before a storm. There was no wind. But everyone could feel it. Something was bound to happen. But I'm not waiting for a storm. What I'm waiting for is time. The moment when all the truth reveals itself on its own. I know, someday, the day will come when that sealed envelope is opened. And when it is, no one will be able to say, I was never told anything about this. George Peterson passed away on a calm morning in June. It was quiet, just like any other day, and it came without any warning. The one who found him was the housekeeper who had worked for the family for many years. She said he was lying on his bed, under a thin blanket, clutching a worn leather journal in one hand. On the last page, written in a short but forceful script, were his final words, finally, I can rest in peace. There were no cries of anguish, no elaborate funeral. Just as he had wished, everything was simple, quiet. No wreaths, no eulogies. Just a few sticks of incense burning in the house he had built from the ground up. And the soft murmur of farewells. It all seemed to be over. But it was only the true beginning. 3 weeks after the funeral, the Peterson family and other involved parties were gathered in a private conference room at a downtown bank. It was the bank where George, in his final years, had deposited his notarized last will and testament. Presiding over the unsealing was the family's longtime legal counsel, Mr. Collins. The room was unnervingly silent. No one raised their voice. Even the soft tap of a pen against the table seemed to echo in the space. At the head of the table sat the nominal heir, the eldest son, Michael. His eyes were fixed on the thick, sealed envelope that lay before him, never wavering for an instant. Next to him sat his wife and their 3 children. Among them was Sarah, the granddaughter who had shared the deepest bond with George. Mr. Collins put on his reading glasses, carefully inspected the official bank seal on the envelope, and then slowly broke it open. Inside were the notarized will, several related documents, and an audio recording made at the time of the will's creation. The air in the room stood still. It was as if everyone had stopped breathing at the very same moment. Mr. Collins began to read. I, George Peterson, born in Chicago, Illinois, in 1943, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, created on the 3rd day of March, 2002 X. Regarding the distribution of my assets, I decree the following. The residential property in East Chicago, with an estimated value of $250,000, shall be inherited by my granddaughter, Sarah Peterson. All shares of stock in Peterson Construction shall be donated in their entirety to the American Tradesman Education Fund, a foundation dedicated to supporting young craftspeople in the region. My savings, totaling approximately $180,000, shall be divided equally among my 3 grandchildren, conditional upon their graduation from a 4-year university or their acquisition of a state-recognized professional license. The words vanished from the room. The color drained from Michael's face. He looked as if he couldn't swallow, as if his throat had seized up completely. Cutting through the thick silence, Mr. Collins's voice continued. And finally, I declared this. To my son, Michael Peterson, I leave nothing. There was only one reason. To the one single sentence he had spoken. The inheritance. It's mine, obviously. That goes without saying. This was my answer. An inheritance is the final fruit of a life of love. It is not a reward for disrespect. Those words hung in the air of the conference room, quiet but sharp, like a blade that had sliced through the heavy silence. Michael, the eldest son, shot up from his chair, his voice cracking as he shouted, I don't accept this. This is a forgery. My father would never do this. His face was a ghastly shade of pale. His hands were trembling, and his voice was a tight wire of fury and disbelief. But Mr. Collins, the attorney, responded immediately, his own voice perfectly calm and measured. We have here an audio recording made at the time the will was executed. This is a legally sound, notarized last will and testament, signed in the presence of 2 witnesses and filed with the county clerk's office, as required by state law. And with that, he pressed a button on a small digital recorder. The voice of George Peterson, clear and unmistakable, filled the room. I, George Peterson, hereby certify that the entire contents of this will are of my own free will, and that this document was created without coercion or undue influence from any party. In the event that any objection should arise, I instruct my attorney to play this recording. No one could say a thing. Michael collapsed back into his chair as if his legs had given out. A sheen of sweat beaded on his forehead, and his lips trembled almost imperceptibly. He had no words left to argue. Or rather, any argument had now become completely meaningless. Sarah, the granddaughter who was now the official heir to the family, home quietly bowed her head and thanked Mr. Brust. Collins, she shed no tears. But in her eyes, a light shone with a mixture of gratitude and a deep, profound sorrow. She whispered, so softly it was almost inaudible. Grandpa, I understand. Thank you. And as the others began to file out of the conference room, only one person remained frozen in his seat, unable to stand. The man who, until just moments ago, had believed with all his heart that everything belonged to him. Some time later, the Petersons' longtime housekeeper shared a story. On the day of the funeral, she said, her voice soft with memory, I was tidying up Mr. Stu Peterson's room. And there, on the nightstand right by his pillow, I found a photograph. It was an old family picture, from when his son Michael was just a little boy. I couldn't help it, she continued, dabbing at her eyes. I just started to cry. That man wasn't living to get even. He was living to teach a lesson. And when he left this world, it was exactly the same. There was no anger left in him. He showed no tears. He simply, quietly, left behind a truth that no one could ever deny. From the day the will was unsealed, the Peterson house, once filled with the warmth of a family, passed through a period of chilling frostiness, and now was wrapped in a silence so deep it felt almost eerie. No one raised their voice anymore. The tension at the dinner table, the arguments over ownership and who was entitled to what, were all gone. Only one person was seen coming and going from the house with any regularity. His granddaughter, Sarah. She came every weekend, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and a single notebook. It was the journal her grandfather, George Peterson, had left behind. a precious volume filled with his notes on construction, his philosophy as a builder, and all the questions he never had the chance to finish writing down. Sarah never moved into the house. Even though the deed was now in her name, she simply said, "I want to keep this house just as it is for as long as I can, as a model home, a place to teach the next generation." Meanwhile, the son who had once believed that everything is mine, he had not set foot in his father's old room since that day. He resigned as president of the company of his own accord. Yeah, no one had blamed him. No one had shouted at him. It was just that the right to hold that position had vanished from within him. In time, the company stock that George had gifted was officially transferred, and at a new training facility established in downstate Illinois, a handsome sign was erected bearing his name. It was called the Peterson Center, and engraved on the plaque out front were these words: "A place dedicated to preserving the value of craftsmanship and honoring the man who built the foundation." Now, in the world of construction and the trades, there isn't a single person who doesn't know the Peterson name. But no one calls him the president of Peterson Construction anymore. Everyone uses a different title. A simpler one, but one that carries far more weight. The last master builder. One day, about 3 months after the funeral, the youngest grandson sent an email to Mr. Collins. "I never would have believed that a single piece of paper, a single will, could change a person so completely. But he's really changed. Since that day, my dad hasn't said a single word about money. Every morning, he sits out on the back porch, and he quietly waters that old oak tree, the one he used to say was in the way. I think my dad is finally starting to understand. It might be too late, but I think he's starting." On an afternoon in mid-October, Sarah held a small gathering at the old Peterson house. The guests she invited were university students studying architecture, young apprentices from the new training center in Illinois, and a few of the old neighbors from down the street. On the dining room table, her grandfather's journal lay open. On the wall hung a photograph of a young George Peterson on a construction site. His gaze was sharp, but his smile was gentle. Sarah spoke quietly to the small crowd. "My grandfather didn't leave his fortune to his blood relatives. He left it to the people who deserved its value. He told me something once. Don't live your life just to be liked by everyone. Live in a way that you wouldn't be ashamed to face the people who quietly stood by you and supported you." One of the young apprentices stood up and bowed his head deeply. "I never had the chance to meet him. But because of him, I was able to get a start in a trade. I have a real career now. I will never, ever forget that. No one could have imagined it. That a single last will and testament could become a mirror, reflecting the true morality of an entire family. He left no sermons behind. He sought no medals or accolades. What he left behind wasn't money. It was a way to end things. Without a single word, he took the chain of forgotten gratitude, and he broke it, cleanly and completely. And from that day forward, a saying began to spread quietly among the tradespeople: don't you wait until the will is read to realize you've lost the one person who was always silent. All Muntapari. All. A final word to all who have listened. This was the story of George Peterson, who passed away at the age of 82. It was the story of a father who believed, for most of his life, if I just stay quiet, the family will be fine. But in the end, he raised his voice. Without saying a word. A will is not just a piece of paper for dividing up assets. A will is a reflection of the heart. If your own parents are still with you, don't wait for them to call. Reach out to them. Never think, it's all going to be mine anyway. See? Think of an inheritance not as a right to receive, but as a trust to be earned. If you have ever received unconditional love, please just say, thank you. Even just that one phrase. And so, if you have ever spoken words that left a lasting scar, while there is still time, while they can still hear your voice, please try to take those words back. Because on the day the will is finally read, what catches in your throat might not be your share of the inheritance. It could very well be the final line. That person once loved you more than anything, but you had already forgotten how to love them in return.